The wind carried stories long before humans could write them. 50,000 years ago, the earth belonged not to one kind of human, but to many. There were those who thrived in the icy tundra, their bodies built like fortresses against the cold. Others roamed the mountains, breathing thin air as if it were made for them alone. And then there were the newcomers, the ones who painted their thoughts on cave walls and dreamed of things they could not yet name. On this night, the world was still undecided. Dominance was not promised. Survival was not guaranteed. The future trembled like a flame in the dark, waiting to be claimed. Snow clung to their hair and eyelashes as they moved through the valley. The group of Homo sapiens, no more than 20 souls, walked in a single, wavering line. Each step cracked the crust of ice, revealing soft earth beneath, and each breath rose in ghostly spirals, vanishing into the twilight. At their center walked Lani, a young woman whose fingers were always restless, shaping sticks into arrows even as she trudged through the snow. Her people had followed the reindeer herds from warmer plains, drawn north by hunger and curiosity. The elders said there was land beyond the mountains, a place rich with rivers and game. But the land they now entered did not feel like a promise. It felt like a warning. A distant glow broke the monotony of the cold night. At first, they thought it was the moon playing tricks on the horizon. Then they saw it flicker. Fire. Lani crouched, signaling the others to stop. Their leader, Kael, moved to her side. He had a face carved by hardship, high cheekbones, eyes sharp as flint. He stared at the distant light, silent for a long moment. "Not ours," he said finally. The fire burned steady, far too controlled to be an accident. Around it, shadows moved, thick-bodied figures, broader and heavier than any of Lani's people. Even at this distance, she could sense their power, like boulders that had learned to walk. "They are the ones the elders spoke of," murmured Aru, an older hunter with scars across his arms like claw marks. "The children of the ice." Neanderthals. The firelight revealed details the cold had tried to hide. Thick pelts wrapped around stocky frames, massive hands carving meat from the carcass of a red deer. Their movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, as though each action carried the weight of generations. Lani had heard stories of them. Beasts, some said. Others whispered they were spirits wearing human faces. But as she watched, she saw something achingly familiar. One of them, perhaps the youngest, reached to adjust the fire, and another, older figure leaned down to ruffle his hair. A gesture so ordinary, so human, it hollowed out her breath. Kael motioned for silence. "We move at first light," he said. "We keep to the river. No contact." But Lani couldn't look away. She noticed their tools, short, heavy spears tipped with stone so finely flaked it caught the firelight like glass. She thought of her own arrows, long and slender, designed to kill from a distance. Two worlds, she realized, separated not by the land but by the way they shaped it. As the sapiens withdrew into the darkness, the wind shifted, carrying their scent toward the Neanderthal camp. One of the stocky figures paused mid-motion, nostrils flaring. He rose slowly, scanning the tree line, and for a moment, his gaze cut through the night like a blade. Lani felt it, an invisible thread pulling her chest tight. Their eyes met across the distance. His were amber, reflecting the fire like molten metal. Neither moved, neither breathed. It was not recognition, not exactly. It was something older, deeper, a silent question neither knew how to answer. The Neanderthal blinked first, turning back to his people as if nothing had happened. But Lani knew something had passed between them, something that would not vanish with the dawn. As they retreated into the forest, Kael muttered, "This land is not empty. We walk among rivals." Rivals. The word tasted strange in Lani's mouth. These beings were not animals, not prey. They were possibilities, another version of what she might have been, had the world spun differently. Behind her, the glow of the fire dimmed into the cold night, but the image of those amber eyes burned hotter than any flame. Dawn arrived like a blade of pale fire slicing through the forest. The cold had hardened overnight, turning the ground into stone and the river into a silver ribbon beneath a crust of ice. The sapiens moved in silence, their breath steaming in soft bursts, their feet leaving faint impressions that looked more like ghost marks than tracks. Kael led them along the river's edge. His senses were sharpened by decades of hunger, by the kind of vigilance that made sleep a shallow, fragile thing. He didn't trust the quiet. The forest was too still, as though holding its breath. Lonnie walked near the middle of the line, the safest place for someone not yet proven in the hunt. She held her bow tight, the sinew string humming softly in the cold, like something alive. Her thoughts kept circling back to the firelight she had seen the night before, to those amber eyes that seemed carved from the same earth they all walked on. "Do you think they saw us?" she asked Aru, who trudged beside her. "They smell everything," he said. His voice was like gravel dragged across stone. "If they didn't see us, they will. The ice children are slow, but they are not blind." Lonnie swallowed. "What will they do?" Aru didn't answer, and that silence was worse than any words he might have spoken. Behind them, the Neanderthals had indeed found the tracks. Two of them crouched low, their heavy hands pressing into the snow, feeling the story it told. The older one, hair graying like the frost that clung to the pines, grunted softly, a sound that carried meaning as surely as words. Strangers. Not deer, not bison. Human, but not of their kind. The younger male, the one with the amber eyes, stood and scanned the trees. His breath came slow and deliberate, his mind assembling fragments of scent and sound into a map no one could see but him. The newcomers were lighter, quicker. They carried things the Neanderthals did not recognize, sticks that smelled of sinew and resin, their tips sharp but strange. He didn't know whether to see them as threat or opportunity. The sapiens stopped by a bend in the river where the ice had cracked, revealing black water beneath. Kael knelt, examining the edges of the fissure. "We move fast," he said. "The river will freeze solid by next moon. If we cross now, we keep our lead." But crossing was dangerous. The ice might hold, or it might shatter, swallowing them into water cold enough to kill before they could draw breath. "We should wait," said Mara, one of the elders, her voice carrying the weight of age and authority. "And be caught?" Kael's reply was sharp, not cruel but edged with fear. "This is their land. We cannot linger." The group murmured uneasily. Lonnie found her gaze drifting again to the tree line behind them, expecting, half hoping, to see a flicker of movement. She imagined those stocky figures closing the distance, imagined how their voices might sound up close. Would they speak like her people did? Would their laughter feel familiar? Far upriver, the Neanderthals moved parallel to the sapiens, their progress slower but surer. They didn't rush. They never did. They knew the land intimately, knew how to let it carry them forward without effort. The amber-eyed male, his people called him Var, paused to sniff the wind. He could taste the stranger's fear in the air, as tangible as the scent of pine resin or wet stone. His people had seen these newcomers before, once or twice in the far south. They were clever, yes, but fragile. Their limbs were long and thin, their voices carried strange melodies. Still, they were dangerous. The last encounter had ended in blood. Kael's people began their crossing. One by one, they slid across the frozen river, crouching low to distribute their weight. The ice groaned beneath them, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through their bones. Lonnie followed Aru, her fingers trembling against the bowstring. Halfway across, she made the mistake of looking down. Beneath the ice, the river seemed alive, a dark current writhing like some ancient beast waiting to devour the unwary. "Don't stop!" Aru hissed. She forced herself forward, step by careful step, until her boots met the opposite bank. Only then did she let herself breathe. By the time the last of them crossed, the sun had climbed high enough to cast long, skeletal shadows across the snow. They pushed on, deeper into the forest, unaware that their trail was being mirrored on the other side of the river. Var and his kin reached the crossing point hours later. He crouched to examine the ice. The cracks told him everything. How many had crossed, how quickly they'd moved, even where one of them had faltered. He placed his hand on the ice, feeling its memory, and in that gesture was something almost sacred, a dialogue between creature and world. He rose, glancing toward the forest. The strangers were moving fast, but they didn't know the land. They didn't know where the river narrowed, where the ridges funneled travelers into traps set by stone and snow. His people knew. As night approached, Kael's group built a small fire, careful to shield it with stones so its glow wouldn't betray them. They ate, sparingly, dried meat, roots dug from frozen soil. Around the flames, their voices were low, almost reverent. "What happens if they find us?" Lonnie asked. "They won't," Kael said flatly. But Mara's eyes flicked to the darkness beyond the firelight. "No one truly owns this land," she murmured. "We all borrow it, until something stronger takes it back." Her words lodged in Lonnie's chest like a splinter. Stronger. She wasn't sure if she wanted that to mean her people or theirs. Far away, beneath a canopy of stars, Var sat with his kin around their own fire. They carved fresh spear points, the flakes of stone glinting like frost. One of the elders spoke in a slow, rhythmic hum, recounting a story older than memory, a story of how their people had always held the north, how they were shaped by it as surely as the rivers and mountains. But as Var listened, his thoughts drifted to the girl he had seen in the trees. Her face had been narrow, her eyes wide with something he couldn't name. Curiosity, perhaps, or defiance. He tightened his grip on the spear. Whatever she carried inside her, it was not like them. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that unsettled him more than any threat of battle. The snow had stopped falling sometime in the night, leaving the world sharp and brittle under the first bruised light of dawn. Frost clung to every branch like shards of broken glass, and the river, once a restless ribbon of black water, was sealed beneath a skin of ice so thin it sang when the wind touched it. We had followed the bison for 2 days, their tracks a ragged seam across the frozen plain. They were our salvation. Meat, hide, bone, the promise of one more month alive. But we weren't alone. The others had been shadowing us since yesterday. I'd seen their silhouettes at dusk, darker shadows against the dying light. Squat, broad-shouldered, moving with a confidence born from knowing this land better than we ever could. Neanderthals. We didn't speak of them around the fire, but everyone felt the pressure in the air, the way animals do before a storm. We found the herd at mid-morning, clustered in a shallow basin where the wind had stripped the snow thin, exposing tufts of yellowed grass. 13 bison, their breath rising in pillars of mist. They were restless, hooves churning the crust, sensing predators near. Our leader, Eno, motioned for silence. We fanned out along the ridge, each of us clutching a spear tipped with fire-hardened wood and stone blades no bigger than a man's hand. Hunting was always a gamble, but here, out in the open, with no trees for cover, it was worse than usual. Bison were walls of muscle with horns sharp enough to split bone. One mistake, and they'd trample us into the earth. Still, hunger makes gamblers of us all. Eno raised his arm. Wait until they drift closer to the choke point where the basin narrowed. Then we'd drive them into the ice, where their weight might shatter the surface, slowing them down. That was our advantage, not strength, but strategy. A flicker of movement caught my eye. Across the basin, on the opposite ridge, they were here. Neanderthals. There were 6 of them, maybe 7, clad in heavy furs stitched so tight they looked like the earth itself had risen to hunt. Their spears were thicker than ours, shafts carved from whole trunks, tips massive and unfluted. They didn't need finesse. Their bodies were the weapon. Even from this distance I could see their posture. Low, solid, like predators ready to spring. "They'll go for the same herd," whispered Sella, the youngest of us, her breath fogging the air. Eno didn't answer. He didn't need to. The Neanderthals weren't here to share. Here's the thing about them. The thing you notice only when they're close enough for the details to cut through the fear. They're stronger. Not just a little, Each one is like two of us pressed into a single frame. Their bones are thicker, muscles coiled like ropes under their skin. If one of them grabs you, you don't break free. But they're not built for running. Their lungs can't draw as much air. Their stride wastes energy. We, on the other hand, can run until the earth changes seasons beneath our feet. That difference, that invisible thread of evolution, was the only reason we were still here at all. The herd shifted, snorting nervously, hooves striking sparks from the frozen ground. Eno cursed under his breath. We didn't have time for hesitation. He gestured the signal. We'd push forward, force the bison into the ice before the Neanderthals closed the gap. We moved as one, a scatter of dark shapes spilling from the ridge, spears angled low, feet finding rhythm in the snow. My heart thudded in my chest, a drumbeat syncing with the pounding hooves ahead. The bison bolted, exactly as we'd hoped, funneling toward the narrow channel of ice, but so did they. The Neanderthals erupted from their ridge like a storm breaking, bellowing deep-chested cries that made the air vibrate. They didn't bother with stealth. Their hunt was all momentum, all brute certainty. For one brief, impossible heartbeat, predator and predator locked eyes across the frozen basin. And then the world shattered. The first bison hit the ice and went through. Water exploded upward, a dark wound in the white silence. Others swerved too late, their massive bodies skidding and colliding, chaos blooming like fire. We plunged into the maelstrom, spears stabbing, voices hoarse with effort. I drove my point into the flank of a young bull, felt the stone bite deep, felt the surge of life trying to rip my arm from its socket as it stumbled. Beside me, Sella's spear glanced off bone, and she went down hard, snow puffing around her like smoke. I hauled her up without thinking. Behind us, the Neanderthals were already in the thick of it. They didn't stab from a distance the way we did. They waded in close, planting their feet like trees, driving their enormous spears with both hands until the tips punched through hide and muscle. One of them, a giant with a mane of tangled hair, heaved a dying bison sideways as if it were no heavier than a fallen branch. For a moment, I was struck dumb by the sheer efficiency of it. Different bodies, different minds, solving the same problem with different answers. And then the giant saw me. He came fast, faster than I thought possible for something that solid. I stumbled back, raising my spear too late. His own weapon swung in a low arc meant to sweep my legs, and only instinct saved me. I threw myself sideways, feeling the rush of air as the spear cut past. He roared, a sound more animal than human, and lunged again. But this was where we were different. I didn't meet his charge head-on. I let him come, then pivoted, sliding over the ice like water over stone. My spear darted out, not for a killing blow, but to buy space, to keep him thinking, moving, burning through that reservoir of power his body carried like a curse. We circled, two stories of the same species, mirror and shadow. Around us, the herd was breaking. Half the bison had fled back toward the ridges, their hooves striking thunder on the frozen earth. Two bodies lay still in the ice, steaming blood pooling in dark blooms that spread like ink. Eno's voice cut through the chaos. "Fall back!" Our plan had failed. The Neanderthals had lost one of their own, a heavy-set female crushed beneath a bull's hooves. But they'd claimed most of the kill. We were running out of spears, out of luck. And yet, as I backed away, my eyes never left the giants. He didn't follow. He just stood there, chest heaving, blood spattered across his furs in bright, arterial streaks. There was no triumph in his expression, only something that felt uncomfortably familiar. Hunger sharpened by fear. We retreated to the tree line, dragging Sella between us, our breath pluming in ragged bursts. Behind us, the Neanderthals gutted their prize with brutal precision, their voices carrying across the frozen plain like the chanting of priests. No one spoke until we'd put a mile between us and the basin. Then Sella, pale but alive, broke the silence. "They'll follow us." Eno shook his head. "Not today. They've got meat now. They'll stay put." But even he didn't sound convinced. Because here's the thing about rivals. One encounter is never the end. It's the beginning of a ledger, a debt written in blood and hunger. And somewhere deep in my chest, beneath the exhaustion, a cold certainty took root. This land wasn't big enough for both of us. The smell of blood clung to my hair long after the wind should have carried it away. Even as we staggered back to the shelter of the rocks, I could taste iron on my tongue, as though the air itself had turned to metal. The clash with the Neanderthals had not been a victory, not for us and not for them. It had been something else, something raw, senseless, and we had thought we understood the world. We believed that danger had a shape, the curve of a mammoth's tusk, the gleam of a saber-tooth's eye. But those things were predictable. They killed because they must, because hunger drives teeth and claws. Today was different. Today we met rivals who looked like us, who thought like us, who fought not as beasts but as hunters, guarding their own claim to life. The fire burned low that night. We did not dare make it larger. The glow might draw them back. Shadows jumped across the stone walls of our refuge, their shapes too much like the hulking figures we had faced hours earlier. No one spoke at first. Words felt fragile, like they might shatter under the weight of WW. Naru, my closest friend, sat across from me. His arm was wrapped in strips of hide where a stone-tipped spear had grazed him. The blood had stopped, but his eyes burned brighter than the fire. "They won't stop," he said finally, voice hoarse. "Not after this." I thought of their leader, the one with the scar that carved down his face like a riverbed dried by time. He had not attacked recklessly. He had watched us. He had understood us. And when we broke away, when the clash dissolved into flight, I had looked back and seen him standing among his fallen, gripping a broken spear, his gaze locked on mine. There had been no triumph in his stare, only a promise. Next time, it will end. But part of me wondered, was he thinking the same of us? We ate little that night. The meat tasted like ash. Every bite reminded me of how fragile the line was between hunger and power, and how close we all stood to being swept away. Once, I believed the earth belonged to anyone brave enough to claim it. Now I wondered if the earth belonged to no one at all, if it merely tolerated us until it grew tired of our noise. As the others dozed, I stayed awake, listening to the quiet breathing of my kin. I thought of the Neanderthals' faces, how different they seemed at first, and how similar they looked when fear struck them, how similar they looked when they bled. Their brows were heavier, their bodies thicker, but behind their eyes I had glimpsed something unsettling. The same fire we carried inside, the same refusal to vanish. And yet, one of us would. That thought would not leave me. I remembered what the elders used to say. Every river must choose a path, or it will drown in its own flood. Back then, I never understood. Now, as I traced the scar forming across my forearm from today's fight, I began to see what they meant. Two rivers had met today, crashing together in a surge of rage and fear. One would carve a valley, the other would fade into the earth. "Sleep," whispered Ayla, our healer, as she passed by, her hands smeared with herbs and ash. "Tomorrow, we move." Her tone was steady, but her eyes betrayed the same question burning in mine. Move where? Every direction seemed to lead closer to another clash, another reckoning we weren't ready for. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of frost from the mountains. Winter was coming sooner than we expected. I imagined the Neanderthals smelling it too, preparing as we were, sharpening their spears, strengthening their shelters. Survival wasn't just a battle against the cold or hunger anymore. It was a battle against time itself, a race to become something stronger before the world decided neither of us deserved to stay. I finally closed my eyes, but sleep brought no rest. I dreamed of rivers turning red, of shadows growing longer, of faces, ours and theirs, melting into each other until I could no longer tell which belonged to my people and which belonged to them. When I jolted awake, heart pounding, the fire was nearly dead. Dawn crept over the land like a slow spill of ash and gold. We gathered in silence, each of us wearing the same question on our faces. What now? My gaze fell on the broken spear we had taken from the Neanderthals, its flint point chipped but still deadly. I reached for it and felt its weight. It was heavier than ours, balanced differently, but there was something almost elegant about its design. Holding it, I realized the truth. They were learning, too. Every clash was not just a fight for food or territory, it was an exchange of knowledge, whether we wanted it or not. And knowledge changes everything. I tightened my grip on the spear. The others were watching me, waiting for me to speak, but I had no grand words to offer. All I could say was what we all already knew. We can't stay here. No one argued. Far away, a raven circled in the pale sky, its cry thin and sharp as broken bone. I watched it disappear into the mountains and felt the pull of something larger than fear, a sense that we were stepping into a story far older than ourselves, one we didn't yet understand. And for the first time, I wondered if understanding it might be the only thing that would save us. We left as the sun clawed its way above the horizon, a pale circle bleeding through the fog. No songs or no rituals, just the crunch of frost under our feet and the quiet rasp of breath misting in the air. Our world had shrunk to essentials: weapons, meat, fire, and the memory of faces we could not forget. Behind us, the valley seemed almost peaceful, its scars hidden by the soft veil of morning. But we carried those scars with us. Each of us had something broken, a spear shaft, a bruised rib, a faith we hadn't realized was fragile until it splintered. We were no longer moving because we wanted to. We were moving because staying had become a kind of death. The land ahead was not kind. Winter had begun its slow strangling of the earth, turning rivers to brittle glass and forests to silent cathedrals of ice. The snow, when it came, did not fall gently. It attacked, each flake a shard of cold cutting through fur and skin, erasing tracks as if the world wanted to pretend we had never been there. Naru walked beside me, his wounded arm stiff against his chest. He said little, though now and then I caught him glancing at the mountains where the Neanderthals had fled. His jaw was tight, his breath sharp. I knew what he was thinking, because I thought it too. They are watching us. Even as we trudged into new territory, I felt their presence like a shadow pressed against my back. Rivals do not simply vanish. They follow, they wait, they learn. That night, we found shelter beneath a cliff where the wind had carved a hollow into the stone. Ayla tended to the wounded, grinding roots into paste, her hands moving with mechanical precision, but her eyes kept drifting to the fire, where the rest of us sat in a circle, staring at the flames as if they might speak. It was Naru who finally broke the silence. "They are like us," he said, voice low but cutting through the crackle of burning wood, "and because of that, they will not forgive." His words settled heavily over us. Some nodded. Others looked away, unwilling to give shape to the thought gnawing at their hearts. I traced a line in the dirt with the tip of my spear. The shape it formed was meaningless, yet it felt like a question drawn into the earth. What must we become to survive this? When the fire burned low, I stepped away from the group and climbed to the edge of the cliff. From there, I could see the world stretch out in layers of shadow and frost, the mountains rising like broken teeth, the river below frozen mid-motion. I imagined the Neanderthals crossing that same river somewhere unseen, their breaths fogging the same air, their hands gripping weapons made sharper by their last defeat. And I thought of something else, a memory from my childhood, when the elders spoke of rivers that devoured other rivers, swallowing their currents until only one remained. Back then, I believed those were just stories, meant to keep us close to the fire. Now, standing in the cold with the wind clawing at my face, I wondered if we were already caught in such a flood. The next morning brought new resolve. We began to prepare, not just for travel but for change. We stripped our spears and rebuilt them stronger, shaping points not only to pierce but to endure. We studied the land as if it were a living thing, learning how the snow drifted, how the ice cracked, how the wind carried sound farther than it should. Every small detail felt like a weapon waiting to be sharpened. Ayla surprised us all. Quiet and watchful, she had always been our healer, never our fighter. But now she stood beside me, holding a spear she had crafted herself. "If they come again," she said, her voice steady, "I will not just mend wounds, I will help make them." Her words carried through the group like a spark through dry grass. We were becoming something else, though none of us could yet name what it was. On the 5th day of our march, we found the tracks. Massive, deep, pressed into the snow like the earth itself had taken a step. Mammoths, a whole herd, moving north, their migration carving a path of destruction and promise in equal measure. Meat enough to sustain us through winter or to draw every rival within reach. I knelt beside one of the prints, running my fingers over its frozen edge, and felt the rhythm of the story pulling us forward. This was more than survival. This was a test written in flesh and ice. "We follow," I said. No one disagreed. That night, as we camped on the edge of a frozen plain, I dreamt of rivers again. But this time, they weren't colliding. They were winding toward the same sea, their waters mingling, indistinguishable from one another. When I woke, the meaning of the dream clung to me like frost. To outlast them, we must become more than they are. But to become more, we must first understand what they are. The mammoth herd would lead us deeper into lands neither we nor the Neanderthals had claimed. Somewhere in that frozen wilderness, we would find not just food, but an answer to the question that had haunted me since the clash began. Who disappears, and who remains to tell the story? As dawn broke, pale and merciless, we rose as one. Spears glinted in the light. Our breaths rose like smoke. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the herd moved, and with it, the shadow of our rivals. And though my hands trembled as I tightened the strap on my spear, my voice did not waver when I whispered to the cold. "We will not be the ones to vanish." The first sight of the herd came at dusk, when the world seemed caught between breath and heartbeat. Across the frozen plain, they moved like living mountains, woolly mammoths, their massive forms half swallowed by drifting snow. Their tusks gleamed faintly in the fading light, pale crescents cutting through the mist, while their breath poured out in ghostly clouds that rolled and twisted like restless spirits. To anyone else, they might have seemed eternal, a force older than memory. But to us, they were both salvation and doom. We crouched low among a cluster of ice-scarred rocks, our bodies trembling not from cold but from the weight of the moment. The hunger gnawed at our bellies like an old enemy whispering promises, but hunger alone would not drive us to face such beasts. It was what they represented, the difference between fading quietly into the frost or carving our place into the marrow of this land. "They're moving north," Naru murmured, his good arm resting on his spear. His breath fogged the air, a fragile thread of life in the vast silence, toward the pass. Isla narrowed her eyes. "And so are they," she said, almost to herself. I didn't have to ask who she meant. On the far edge of the plain, just where the mist thickened into shadows, I glimpsed movement. Dark figures, stooped and broad, blending almost perfectly with the land. Neanderthals. They were keeping pace with the herd, mirroring our movements without closing the gap. Watching, waiting. "They know," I said. Naru's jaw tightened. "Then we take it first." But taking it would not be simple. The herd was restless. The matriarch, an enormous female with tusks worn by decades of ice and battle, kept her calves pressed between her legs, her ears flaring whenever the wind shifted. She sensed predators, even if she couldn't yet see us. Mammoths didn't run when threatened. They turned to face you, a wall of muscle and rage. To strike too soon was to die beneath their feet. We shadowed them for 2 days, moving when they moved, halting when they halted. The land changed as we followed, the snow deepened, the air grew heavier, and the mountains loomed closer, jagged and dark like the teeth of some buried god. The ice here was treacherous, cracking underfoot without warning, and more than once we had to drag someone out by their furs before the freezing water could swallow them whole. Each time, I felt the herd watching us with their small, intelligent eyes, as though they understood that we were as desperate as they were. At night, we made no fire. The cold bit into our bones, turning sleep into a shallow, haunted thing, but a flame would have given us away. Even without seeing them, I could feel the Neanderthals near. Their presence was like pressure in the air, a weight pressing on my chest. Once, as I drifted half awake, I thought I heard a sound, a rhythmic click of stone on stone, carried faintly by the wind. A signal, a promise that they, too, were waiting for their moment. On the third morning, the herd slowed. We came upon them at the edge of a frozen river, its surface fractured like shattered glass. The mammoths were hesitant, the matriarch testing the ice with her massive weight, her ears flicking nervously at every groan from beneath. It was the chance we had been waiting for. Their focus divided, their movement restricted, but it was also the most dangerous place to strike. If the ice failed, it wouldn't just take them. It would take us too. We could drive them toward the pass, Ayla suggested, her voice low but steady. Trap them between the cliffs. And give them room to turn, Naru countered. They'll crush us before we bring one down. Then what? Someone hissed. Wait until they starve? We'll starve first. Their voices bled into each other, sharp and frayed by hunger, but I barely heard them. My gaze was fixed on the far bank of the river. There, among the snow-laden pines, the shadows moved again. Neanderthals. Closer now, their silhouettes clear against the white, their spears glinting like shards of bone. They weren't waiting anymore. They'll strike soon, I said. Naru followed my gaze and swore under his breath. Then we strike first. But before we could act, the ice decided for us. With a sound like thunder muffled beneath the earth, a crack ripped through the river. The matriarch bellowed, a low, guttural roar that shook the air, and the herd erupted into chaos. Calves screamed, bulls swung their tusks wildly, and the ice began to splinter under their weight, jagged lines racing outward like veins of lightning. Move! I shouted. We surged forward, fanning out the way the elders had taught us, each of us aiming for a single point. The youngest bull, slightly separated from the herd. He stumbled as the ice shifted beneath him, his massive frame lurching, vulnerable for just a heartbeat. Spears flew. The first struck his shoulder, sinking deep into the thick fur. He bellowed and swung his head, but before he could regain balance, another spear drove into his flank. Blood sprayed in a hot arc across the frozen air, staining the snow crimson. We closed in, teeth bared, breath ragged, the world shrinking to the rhythm of strike and evade, strike and evade. But we weren't alone in the kill. A howl cut through the chaos, not the call of an animal, but the raw, guttural cry of men. From the far bank, the Neanderthals charged. Their spears glittered as they hurled them across the river, some striking the bull, others embedding themselves in the ice at our feet. They didn't care who claimed the kill. They only cared that we didn't. The bull went down with a final, shuddering groan, his massive body crashing through the weakened ice. For a moment, everything held still. The herd retreating into the mist, our breath fogging in stunned silence, the bull's blood spreading like dark fire beneath the ice. Then the world shattered. The Neanderthals hit us like a storm, their broad bodies moving with brutal precision. We met them with the desperation of cornered animals, our spears clashing in sprays of ice and blood. There was no formation, no strategy, only survival. The river groaned beneath us, threatening to devour us all, but neither side yielded. And through it all, the mammoths kept moving, their silhouettes vanishing into the mist, indifferent to the war waged over their flesh. By the time we broke away, half our number was bleeding, and the Neanderthals had lost just as many. Neither side had truly won. We dragged what meat we could from the bull's carcass, our hands shaking, our breaths ragged. Across the fractured ice, they did the same. For the first time, I saw their faces clearly. One of them, a young male with a scar cutting through his brow, locked eyes with me. His expression was not hatred, not even anger. It was something colder, something that mirrored the thought pounding in my own skull. Only one of us will see the end of this story. The mammoths were gone by morning. Their tracks, deep and deliberate, cut across the snow like scars, leading north into the white void where the mountains swallowed the sky. We followed them for a while, limping, hungry, our bodies stiff from the clash on the river. But the herd had gained too much distance in the chaos, and even their youngest calves moved with a determination that mocked our exhaustion. Each step they took seemed to erase them further, as though the land itself was conspiring to keep them from us. "Let them go," Ayla said finally, her voice hoarse. She was walking ahead of me, her fur-lined hood rimed with frost. "We can't catch them now." I wanted to argue. I wanted to believe we could push farther, force the world to bend to our will the way we had always imagined it would. But I could feel the truth in my bones, as undeniable as the cold. The herd wasn't just escaping us. They were leaving us behind. We returned to what remained of the kill. The bull's carcass was a shadow of what it had been, stripped by both us and the Neanderthals in the dark hours after the fight. The river had claimed what neither of us could carry, sucking chunks of meat and shattered bone beneath the ice, as if the earth itself was hungry too. Even now, the blood-stained water steamed faintly, as though mocking the warmth we'd spilled into it. Naru stood over what was left of the skull, his face set like stone. "One bull," he muttered. "For all that?" "It's enough to live," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure they were true. Behind us, the wind carried voices, low, guttural, deliberate. I turned to see the Neanderthals on the far bank, their shapes half obscured by drifting snow. They weren't attacking. Not now. They were watching again, just as they had before, their heavy faces unreadable. One of them raised a spear, not as a threat, but almost as a salute, and then they melted back into the trees. "They'll be there when the herd circles back," Ayla said. "If the herd circles back." "They won't," I said, and I didn't know why I believed it, only that I did. Something about the way the matriarch had moved, deliberate, unhurried, as though she was walking not just away from us, but away from this place entirely, told me we'd never see them again. That night, we made fire for the first time in days. The flames licked the air hungrily, casting long, quivering shadows on the snow. We roasted slivers of meat, our fingers numb even as we held them close to the heat. No one spoke much. Words felt too heavy, too sharp, like stones we weren't ready to lift. As I chewed on a strip of sinew, my mind wandered, not to the fight, not even to the mammoths, but to the look on the Neanderthal's face as he met my eyes across the ice. It haunted me, that expression, not rage, not triumph, just understanding, as if we were reflections of each other, locked in a game neither of us had invented, but both were doomed to finish. "What if they're thinking the same thing we are?" I asked suddenly. Ayla glanced at me, her eyes catching the firelight. "What do you mean?" "That the land isn't big enough for both of us." She didn't answer right away. The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks upward, and for a moment I thought she wouldn't answer at all. Then she said, quietly, "Then one of us is right." Sleep came hard, full of restless dreams. I saw the herd moving through the mist, their forms stretching impossibly tall, their tusks like white rivers curving toward the horizon. I saw the Neanderthals trailing them, their shadows merging with the beasts until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. And somewhere, always just out of sight, something else watched us all, a presence as old as the ice, patient and waiting. We left the river the next morning. The wind had shifted overnight, bringing with it the smell of the sea, faint but undeniable. The land would change again soon. The mountains we'd skirted for so long would narrow into a pass, and beyond that lay the coast, where the frozen earth met the endless water. Some said there was nothing beyond it. Others whispered of lands where the ice gave way to forests and grass, where game moved like storms across the horizon. I didn't know which to believe, but I knew this: we couldn't turn back. As we climbed toward the pass, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. Part of me expected to see the herd returning, their massive bodies blotting out the horizon. Another part expected to see the Neanderthals, their dark figures cresting the ridge behind us. But the plain was empty now, save for the wind scouring our tracks away. By midday, the snow began to fall again, thick, heavy flakes that blurred the line between earth and sky. We moved slower, our bodies hunched against the cold, the meat we'd carried already dwindling. Every so often, I'd catch someone looking at the mountains with that same hollow stare I'd seen on my own reflection in frozen streams. Hunger does that to you. It makes you small inside, even when you're trying to stand tall. But it wasn't just hunger anymore. It was something larger, something I didn't yet have words for. A sense that we were chasing not just food, but the edge of the world itself, and that somewhere out there, the world was deciding who belonged to it. That night, as we huddled beneath an overhang of rock, Isla sat beside me, silent for a long time before finally speaking. "When they vanish," she said softly, "what do you think happens to them? The mammoths, the Neanderthals, all of them." I thought about the herd's tracks fading into the white, about the Neanderthals' eyes across the ice, about the dreams that felt more real than the waking world. And I said, maybe they don't vanish. Maybe they become the land. Isla gave a small, tired smile. And us? I stared into the dark, listening to the wind whistle through the stones like a voice too ancient to understand. "Maybe we become the story," I said. And as I spoke the words, I wondered, not for the first time, whether being the story would save us or destroy us. The snow had stopped falling, but the world was no less cold. It was the kind of cold that bit into the marrow of bones, turning breath into knives and silence into something almost alive. The Homo sapiens moved carefully through the frost-bitten valley, their furs stiff with ice, their eyes scanning the pale horizon where shadows of movement hinted at danger. They were no longer simply hunting, they were stalking survival itself. Ahead of them, the Neanderthals had made their stand. Their camp was set among twisted pines, smoke from their fires rising like wounded ghosts into the steel-colored sky. These were not aimless wanderers. They were rooted, fierce, and proud. Their shelters were sturdy, their tools heavy and purposeful, their presence almost monumental, as if carved from the same stone they used to sharpen their spears. The first clash was not planned. It erupted like a storm breaking over the ridge. A young Homo sapiens hunter, eager to prove himself, loosed a spear too soon. The weapon tore through the mist and grazed the shoulder of a Neanderthal guard. His roar shattered the stillness, and in seconds, both sides surged forward. Stones and spears, shouts and guttural cries, the air alive with violence. Up close, the differences were stark. Neanderthals moved like avalanches, shorter, broader, but each strike carried the weight of a falling boulder. Homo sapiens were quicker, weaving and darting, their attacks like stabs of lightning. The ground turned slick with churned snow and blood, the forest echoing with the clash of wills as much as bodies. Then, as suddenly as it began, the chaos fractured. Both sides realized the cost of continuing. There were no victors here, only the mounting weight of exhaustion. The Neanderthals, their numbers thinner than they could afford, began to withdraw, not in panic, but in grim, deliberate steps. They carried their wounded on makeshift sleds, their faces set like weathered masks carved by centuries of endurance. From a ridge above, the Homo sapiens watched them retreat. No one spoke. There was no cheer, no sense of triumph, only the whisper of wind through the trees and the soft creak of mammoth hide cloaks as they shifted uneasily. For a moment, the two species were mirrors of each other, both scarred, both hungry, both driven by something older than memory. And yet, even in silence, a truth settled among the watchers. This was not the end. The Neanderthals' departure was not peace. It was an omen. Somewhere beyond the tree line, they would gather again, their fires burning low but not yet extinguished. And when they returned, it would not be to share the land. The Homo sapiens leader, his breath steaming in the frigid air, tightened his grip on his spear. He did not know why his chest felt heavier as he watched the last Neanderthal vanish into the fog. Perhaps it was pity, perhaps it was fear, or perhaps it was the knowledge, buried deep and unspoken, that only one of them would survive the winter to come. The fog swallowed the Neanderthals, but their absence did not bring ease. The valley felt heavier without them, as though their retreat had left behind an echo, a reminder that this land was not yet claimed. The Homo sapiens remained on the ridge, their silhouettes carved against the fading light, breath rising like smoke from a dying fire. No one moved until the last distant crack of ice marked the enemy's passage into the wilderness. When they descended, they found the remnants of the Neanderthal camp, fire pits still warm, bones charred for marrow, stones etched with faint markings, a crude but deliberate art. One of the hunters crouched near a carved figurine, a figure of a crouched beast with horns. He reached to touch it, but the leader stopped him with a sharp shake of the head. Superstition or respect, it didn't matter. Some things were meant to remain untouched. They pushed onward, their path leading deeper into the frozen expanse. The river they followed had turned to glass, its surface fractured by jagged seams that caught the weak light of the winter sun. Crossing it was slow and perilous. Each step groaned beneath their weight, and the memory of the Neanderthals hung over them like a shadow, as though the ice itself might crack in allegiance with the enemy they could no longer see. Night came suddenly, smothering the land in blue-black silence. They built no fire. The leader ordered it so, fearing that light would betray their position. Wrapped in furs stiff with frost, they huddled beneath the skeletal arms of dead trees, the cold pressing into them like an unspoken question. How long could they endure this? Far off, a sound rose, low, mournful, and unfamiliar. Not the call of wolves, not the groan of shifting ice. It was a Neanderthal horn, blown not in battle but in mourning. For a moment, none of them breathed. The sound faded, swallowed by the wind, but it carried with it a promise. They had not vanished, only fallen back to gather strength. The leader closed his eyes. In the darkness, he saw again the retreating figures, their broad backs bent under the weight of their wounded, their silhouettes framed by fog and firelight. They were not merely rivals, they were something larger, an obstacle carved by nature itself, testing his people's right to survive. As dawn crept over the land, painting the snow in hues of gray and ash, the Homo sapiens rose and continued forward. The world seemed to stretch endlessly before them, ridges like the spines of ancient beasts, forests hunched like watchful sentinels, and rivers coiled like veins through the frozen earth. Somewhere beyond this maze lay the promise of land enough to thrive, or the certainty of death. Behind them, the Neanderthals watched from the tree line, their forms nearly invisible against the frost. Their leader, his arm bound in rough sinew from the wound of the first clash, stared at the departing figures of Homo sapiens. His jaw tightened, his breath steaming like smoke from a smoldering ember. Neither side spoke the language of the other, yet both understood the same truth. The land could not hold them both forever. The snow had not yet buried their footprints when the first scream split the frozen air, a jagged, human sound that cut through the wind like a blade. Kieran froze mid-step, his breath fogging in the pale dawn, and for a moment it was impossible to tell if the echo came from his people or theirs. Then the second cry followed, deeper, guttural, the voice of a Neanderthal, and there was no mistaking it. The confrontation they had both been circling for weeks had finally found them. Across the clearing, shadows erupted from the tree line. Broad-shouldered figures, their furs heavy with frost, advanced with deliberate ferocity. The Neanderthals moved like boulders, rolling downhill, each step measured, each face carved into grim resolve. Kieran's people reacted on instinct, spears raised, slings drawn, their lean frames quivering with the need to act before being crushed. No words were exchanged. There was no language to bridge this moment, only the raw, ancient understanding that one group could not pass while the other still breathed. Kieran tightened his grip on his spear, feeling the polished wood tremble with the pulse in his hands. He could see them clearly now. The scars across their forearms, the ash smeared on their cheeks, the glint of intelligence in eyes so like his own, yet impossibly different. Then the Neanderthal leader, massive, scarred, a living wall of muscle, lowered his club and roared. The clearing erupted into motion. The snow muffled everything except the sound of breath, short, sharp bursts of steam rising into the frozen air. Kael crouched low, his spear angled forward, watching the Neanderthals emerge from the shadows of the tree line. For days, the two groups had circled each other like wolves, testing boundaries, stealing glimpses, and probing weaknesses. Now, at last, the slow dance had ended. The river that divided them had frozen solid overnight, and the Neanderthals had crossed. They came on with deliberate steps, their bodies stockier, their faces heavy-browed and grim. Unlike Kael's people, who adorned themselves with beads and ochre, the Neanderthals carried no decoration, only weapons and scars. Their leader, a broad-shouldered figure wrapped in reindeer hide, raised his hand. Behind him, others dragged branches covered in snow, using them to mask their numbers. It was clever. Kael felt a grudging respect twist through his fear. His own group, Homo sapiens, was leaner, faster. They had spent the morning arranging the battlefield, pits dug into the snow, stones buried under loose powder, and a narrow funnel between two fallen trees to draw the enemy in. It was the kind of trap their minds excelled at, an invisible map stitched into memory. Still, Kael's heart hammered. No plan survived the first throw of a spear. A shout broke the stillness. The first volley flew, heavy spears from the Neanderthals, hurled with terrifying force. One struck a tree trunk beside Kael, splintering the wood as if it had been hit by lightning. The impact rattled his teeth. He barked an order, and his people responded. Lighter spears, faster, more numerous, arcing high through the air like a swarm of angry bees. A Neanderthal fell with a cry, but the others kept advancing, their massive shoulders hunched like bulls. Then came the charge. They crashed into the funnel, just as Kael had hoped, but the sheer weight of their bodies made the ground shake. Kael lunged to the side as one of them, a mountain of muscle with a stone axe, swung down hard enough to cleave a man in two. The sapiens scattered, reforming in smaller groups, circling like hawks. This was their strength: speed, communication, fluidity. Where the Neanderthals fought like walls, the sapiens fought like water. Kael caught the eye of the leader across the melee. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just them. Two visions of survival, two strategies written into flesh. The leader bared his teeth and roared, charging forward with an axe raised high. Kael didn't wait to meet him head-on. He retreated 3 steps, leading him into one of the traps. The ground gave way. With a thunderous crack, the Neanderthal plunged into a pit lined with sharpened stakes. He roared again, not in fear, but fury, as he tried to climb out, blood streaking the snow. Kael hesitated, spear poised. Something inside him faltered. This wasn't just an enemy. It was someone who had lived through the same storms, hunted the same beasts, told stories around the same kind of fire. Killing him felt like striking down a shadow of himself. The hesitation nearly cost him his life. Another Neanderthal tackled Kael from the side, slamming him into the frozen ground. The air whooshed from his lungs as thick fingers clamped around his throat. The man's breath smelled of smoke and marrow. Kael's vision went white at the edges. He stabbed blindly, feeling his spearhead punch through flesh. The grip loosened. Kael rolled free, gasping, and saw the Neanderthal stagger back, hands pressed to his stomach where blood gushed dark and steaming. Their eyes locked, no hatred, only recognition, before the man collapsed. Around them, the battle tilted. The sapiens' traps had taken their toll, and their mobility began to dominate. One by one, the Neanderthals withdrew, dragging their wounded, snarling as they went. They didn't break. They never broke. But their retreat was inevitable. They vanished into the trees as silently as they had come, leaving only churned snow and the bodies of their dead. Kael stood there trembling, not from cold but from something heavier. His people cheered softly, a sound more of relief than triumph, but Kael didn't join them. He stared into the forest, where shadows shifted among the trunks. "This isn't the end," he murmured. Behind him, the sun began to sink, staining the snow a deep crimson, as if the earth itself had been painted in blood. Kael moved through the forest like a shadow, though every breath felt loud in the cold air. The snow had stiffened overnight, turning each step into a brittle crunch that could betray him. Around him, his people advanced in a loose arc, spears angled forward, eyes sharp but tired. They thought the Neanderthals were in retreat. Kael wasn't so sure. A crow flapped overhead, its caw cutting through the stillness like a warning. He raised a hand to halt the group. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind that presses against the skin, heavy and listening. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a branch creaked, not the wind. Too deliberate. Kael crouched, signaling to the others, and scanned the snow for signs. Tracks of the Neanderthals snaked away into the hills, clumsy at first, then sharper, purposeful. They weren't fleeing, they were herding. 100 paces away, hidden behind a tangle of fallen pines, the Neanderthals gathered like wolves. Broad shoulders hunched, breaths steaming in the cold, their eyes glinted with something neither fear nor rage but a dangerous patience. They passed stones between calloused hands, tested the weight of their spears. One of them, massive, scarred, silent, pointed toward the human's approach. Kael felt it before he saw it. That low vibration through the ground, the kind of tremor only bodies in motion create. He turned to warn the others, but the forest erupted. A spear screamed through the air, missing his head by inches and slamming into a tree with a sound like bone cracking. Another followed, then another, a sudden hail of wood and stone. "Shields!" Kael roared, but there was no time. From both sides of the path, the Neanderthals burst forth, their silhouettes broad and monstrous against the pale snow, cutting off escape. One of them barreled straight toward him, a blur of muscle and fur, swinging a club carved from a mammoth's leg bone. Kael braced his spear just as the ground gave way beneath his foot, a trap. His leg plunged into a concealed pit lined with sharpened stakes. The world snapped into chaos. Screams, snow flying, the sickening thud of bodies colliding. As Kael wrenched his leg free, blood already soaking through his furs, the towering Neanderthal closed the distance, club raised high, and then it fell. The club didn't land where Kael expected. At the last instant, he twisted, driving his spear upward. Wood splintered against bone, the point lodged under the Neanderthal's ribs. The giant bellowed, staggering but not falling, and Kael felt the shaft rip from his hands as the creature wrenched it free with terrifying strength. Around him, the clash had become a storm. Homo sapiens scattered and regrouped, their lighter frames weaving between the heavier Neanderthals, striking fast, then vanishing behind trees. But the Neanderthals fought like the land itself, unyielding, each swing of their clubs like a falling tree, each shove enough to break a rib. Kael limped backward, heart hammering. He saw Mara, quick as fire, hurl a stone-tipped spear into an attacker's thigh. The Neanderthal howled but didn't fall. He simply reached down, snapped the shaft, and charged again. They weren't just defending, they were punishing. Then Kael noticed something. The Neanderthals were pushing them toward the river. He remembered the tracks, the deliberate angles, the patience. This wasn't rage, it was strategy. His stomach dropped. The ice there wouldn't hold under a fight. "Not the river!" he shouted, but his voice drowned beneath the cacophony of roars and screams. Already, snow churned under frantic feet as the humans stumbled closer to the water's edge, where fog curled low like a waiting trap. The giant came for him again, club raised high. Kael grabbed a fallen spear and hurled it, not at the man, but at the ice. The shaft struck, cracking the surface with a deep, echoing groan. For a heartbeat, everything paused. Humans, Neanderthals, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then the ice broke. A fissure shot outward like lightning. Water exploded upward, black and freezing, swallowing the edge of the battlefield. 2 Neanderthals went down instantly, dragged under by their own momentum. Screams turned to guttural gasps as the river claimed them. Kael stumbled back, dragging Mara with him. As the chaos shifted, the humans seized the moment, retreating up the bank while the Neanderthals regrouped, their assault fractured by the sudden loss. But even as Kael limped to safety, he locked eyes with the scarred giant across the widening crack of ice. There was no fear in that gaze, only promise. This wasn't over. The snow had begun to fall again, soft at first, then heavier, erasing the tracks of blood that trailed behind Kael's group. Each breath felt like glass in his chest, but they could not rest yet, not after what they had seen. Kael slowed only when the trees grew so dense that even the wind struggled to pass through. The Neanderthal cry, low, guttural, and full of fury, still echoed in his skull. They had fought like cornered beasts, but there had been something deliberate in their retreat, something that unsettled him. This wasn't over. The others collapsed around him, panting, clutching spears with white-knuckled hands. Sira stared into the darkness between the trunks, her lips trembling, but her voice steady. "They'll follow," she said. "They always follow." Kael didn't answer. His eyes had caught something strange in the snow earlier, a line of symbols carved into a tree trunk, deep and precise, not random marks. A warning? A boundary? Or an invitation? The Neanderthals were not as mindless as some believed. They were thinking, adapting, perhaps even planning. He crouched by the faint glow of their fireless camp, the smell of iron and wet fur still clinging to his skin. For a moment, he let his mind drift back to the hunt that had begun this war. The mammoths, the roar of triumph, the belief that they had proven themselves worthy of this land. Now, that belief felt brittle, fragile. Sira touched his shoulder. "What did you see, Kael?" He almost told her about the carvings, about the thought that chilled him more than the cold. What if we are not the hunters anymore? But instead, he said only, "We move at first light." Above them, the snowfall thickened, burying everything in silence. Somewhere beyond the trees, the Neanderthals were gathering again. And for the first time, Kael realized this wasn't just a fight for territory. It was a fight to decide whose memory would endure when the snow stopped falling. The snow had hardened overnight, its surface crusted with ice that cracked beneath each step. Kael led the vanguard, his breath ragged, visible as pale mist against the dim light of dawn. Behind him, the band of Homo sapiens trudged in near silence, their faces drawn tight by hunger and the memory of what they had witnessed, the Neanderthals regrouping, stronger than before. They had not vanished. They had not broken. They were coming. From the ridge, Kael crouched low and scanned the valley. Below, a faint smoke curled upward from a hidden hollow where the Neanderthals had made their camp. Dark figures moved methodically, reinforcing defenses, stacking stones into a barrier. They were preparing for something more than survival. They were preparing for dominance. A murmur rippled through Kael's group. One of the younger hunters whispered, "We should turn back, find new lands." His voice was thin, brittle, like a twig about to snap. Kael's reply was sharper than he intended. "There are no new lands, only theirs, or ours." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of ash and meat. It triggered a memory. The last clash, the brute strength of the Neanderthals, their fists like hammers, their roars rolling like thunder. He still bore the bruise on his ribs, a deep ache that pulsed with every breath, a reminder that they were not invincible. Neither side was. As they descended into the shadow of the valley, the world felt narrower, like a throat closing around them. Kael motioned for them to spread out, their movements deliberate, rehearsed, spears lowered, bows drawn. But then, a sound shattered the cold stillness, a low horn blast, deep and resonant, echoing off the stone walls. It wasn't a call of alarm. It was a challenge. From the tree line, Neanderthals emerged, not in chaos but in formation. Broad-shouldered and resolute, they carried torches that bled orange into the gray morning, their firelight casting monstrous shapes on the snow. At their front was a towering figure Kael had never seen before. Scarred face, wolf pelt draped across his back, eyes like shards of black ice. For a heartbeat, both groups stood frozen, the air thick with anticipation. Then, the Neanderthal leader slammed his torch into the snow, sending sparks skyward like defiant stars. His voice bellowed through the valley, a sound too guttural to translate, yet its meaning was unmistakable. This is our ground. Step forward, and you burn. Kael's knuckles whitened around his spear. Fear gnawed at the edges of his resolve, but beneath it burned something darker, heavier. Not hatred, not even vengeance, just the knowledge that there could be no retreat without erasure. He raised his arm, signaling his people. "We hold," he said, his voice steady, though his pulse raced. "We end this." Above them, a single raven wheeled through the frozen air, its caw slicing through the tension. It circled once, twice, then vanished into the clouds as if the earth itself was holding its breath for what would come next. The two forces moved like mirrored storms. Kael's people fanned out across the icy ground, their spears braced, their breath quick and shallow. Opposite them, the Neanderthals advanced in a slow, deliberate line, each step pounding into the frozen earth with the weight of inevitability. The air between them was a fragile thread, stretched to the point of breaking. Kael crouched low, signaling to the flank hunters. They melted into the scattered pines, shadows among shadows, waiting for his mark. Every detail felt sharpened, the creak of leather bindings on his spear, the way the frost clung to his eyelashes, the faint smell of smoke carried from the Neanderthal torches. Even the silence seemed to hum, charged with violence not yet unleashed. Then it began. A stone hurled from the Neanderthal side cracked against a tree near Kael, splintering bark and scattering snow in a soft explosion. It was not an accident. It was an invitation. Kael answered. He lunged forward, driving his spear into the ice as a signal. The flank hunters erupted from the trees, their arrows cutting arcs through the gray air. The first volley found its mark. 2 Neanderthals staggered back, one dropping to his knees. But they did not falter. They roared, a sound that made Kael's chest vibrate, and surged forward. The clash was brutal, close and fast. Kael's spear caught a charging figure in the thigh, but before he could pull free, another Neanderthal barreled into him like a falling boulder. They tumbled together, the ground hard and unforgiving beneath them. Kael's ribs flared with pain as massive hands clawed for his throat. He twisted, grabbing a shard of ice and driving it upward into his attacker's jawline. Warmth spilled across his fingers, a sick contrast to the frozen earth. Around him, the battle bent and twisted like a living thing. Arrows hissed, spears cracked. The snow churned red under stamping feet. Through the chaos, Kael caught glimpses of his people holding the line, but for each Neanderthal that fell, another surged forward, their torches casting wild, flickering light that made the world feel like it was on fire. And then Kael saw him, the scarred leader, wolf pelt trailing like a banner, moving through the fray with terrifying precision. Every swing of his club shattered shields, sent men sprawling. Their eyes met across the melee, and in that locked stare, Kael felt something unsettling. Not hatred, but recognition. This was not a brute. This was a mind. The leader pointed his club directly at Kael, then bellowed a command. The Neanderthals shifted, their movements suddenly coordinated. They weren't just fighting, they were funneling Kael's group into a narrow choke of ice and rock, cutting off escape. Kael realized it too late. "Bob, back!" he shouted, voice raw against the wind. "Break left!" But the Neanderthals pressed harder, their formation tightening like a noose. Kael's people hesitated, fear splintering their unity. The first cracks in their line began to show, a hunter slipping, another dragged down by sheer weight of muscle. Kael's mind raced. If they stayed, they would be crushed. If they fled, they would be hunted. And then, from the ridgeline above, a sound split the sky. A long, deep rumble, not from man or beast, but from the mountain itself. A slab of ice, loosened by the chaos below, sheared away and thundered down the slope. It slammed into the edge of the battlefield, exploding in a spray of snow and stone that blinded both sides. For a moment, everyone froze, silhouettes ghost-like in the swirling white. Kael seized it. "Move!" he roared, dragging the nearest hunter to his feet. "Through the gap!" His people surged toward the narrow opening the avalanche had carved, stumbling but alive. Behind them, the Neanderthals regrouped, their leader standing firm amid the storm, torch raised high, his shadow long and unwavering. As Kael glanced back, their eyes met again. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. This isn't over. They didn't stop running until the trees swallowed them whole. Kael's legs burned, each step stabbing through his calves as if the ice itself were trying to drag him down. Around him, the hunters gasped and coughed, their breath rising in ragged plumes. The snow had softened here, absorbing their footfalls, but every sound still seemed too loud, the crunch of their boots, the clatter of spears against bone charms tied to their belts, the rasp of fear in their throats. Kael raised a fist. The group slowed, then halted, leaning on their weapons as though they were suddenly twice their age. Behind them, the world they had fled was silent, save for the distant moan of shifting ice. No pursuit. Not yet. "They'll follow," murmured Argon, one of the elder hunters, his voice hoarse. "They don't quit." "They're hurting too," Kael replied, though the words tasted hollow. He could still see the Neanderthal leader's torch blazing in his mind, steady against the storm, a flame that would not go out. That image gnawed at him more than the bruises blooming across his ribs. The group began to take stock. 3 were missing. 2 lay bleeding in the snow, wounds crudely bound. The rest stood silent, exchanging glances heavy with questions no one dared to ask aloud. "We can't stay," said Kael, breaking the stillness. "The river's ahead. If we cross before the freeze lifts, they won't risk following." "And if the ice breaks?" someone asked. "Then we don't make it," Kael said simply. "But if we wait, they catch us. Decide." No one argued. Decisions like these were never really choices. They moved again, slower now, conserving their strength. The forest narrowed, the trees bending inward like ribs around a spine. Strange markings scarred the bark, deep gouges left by tools, not claws. Kael ran a thumb over one. It was fresh. Not Neanderthal, not theirs. A third hand in this land, or just ghosts of some older passage. He shook the thought away. They had no room for mysteries tonight. As they pressed forward, the snow began to glitter faintly in the half-light, a reflection of the river's approach. The air grew colder, sharper, carrying a smell of iron and distant water. Kael's thoughts drifted despite himself. His people's songs spoke of rivers as boundaries, places where the living and the dead brushed shoulders. He wondered which side they were really walking toward. Then he froze. Across the white expanse ahead, shadows moved. Broad, deliberate shapes. The Neanderthals had guessed their route. Kael ducked low, signaling the others to stop. He counted 7, maybe 8 figures, crouched near the river bend, their breath misting like smoke from a forge. They were setting traps. The leader wasn't just chasing them. He was herding them. Argon crept to Kael's side, eyes narrowing. "They know this land better." "They think we'll panic," Kael murmured. "They're not wrong." But as he studied the bend, something else caught his attention. The ice farther downstream, thinner, fractured in jagged webs. Dangerous to cross, deadly even, but open enough to bypass the trap if they moved fast and light. A gamble built on desperation. "We split," Kael decided. "Half draw them in, Make them think we're breaking through. The rest, take the ice. And if the ice doesn't hold? Kael met Argon's gaze. Then we hope the river wants them more than it wants us. There was no time to debate. The hunters fell into position, their movements silent but taut with fear. Kael stayed with the decoy group, gripping his spear so tightly that his knuckles ached. Across the river bend, the Neanderthals shifted, ready to spring their trap. For a heartbeat, everything stilled, two predators staring at each other over a sheet of frozen death. Then Kael gave the signal. The world erupted. Spears cut the air, feet pounded the snow, and the Neanderthals surged forward, howling their defiance. Behind them, the second group slipped toward the fractured ice, their silhouettes vanishing into mist. Kael didn't look back. He couldn't. Every ounce of his focus locked on the Neanderthal leader, who was charging now, wolf pelt snapping like a banner, torchlight flickering across his scarred face. They would meet again on this frozen edge. Kael realized, not because fate demanded it, but because neither would allow the other to leave. The first clash came like thunder on the ice. Kael hurled his spear low, not to kill, but to scatter the Neanderthal charge. It struck the snow in front of them, kicking up a burst of frost. The leader didn't flinch. He barreled through, torch raised high, his hunters fanning out with brutal precision. Their voices were raw, guttural, more than a cry of battle. It was a vow. "Ah, back!" Kael shouted, drawing his stone blade. The decoy group fell into a jagged retreat, giving ground but never turning their backs, forcing the Neanderthals to believe they were desperate to break through. The air rang with the clash of wood on wood, the tearing sound of spears splintering. Beneath their feet, the frozen river groaned. Farther downstream, the second group moved in near silence, their breaths shallow, steps measured. The fractured ice glistened like shards of glass, veins of black water flickering beneath its thin crust. Each footfall sent hairline cracks racing outward, delicate and treacherous as a spider's web. One hunter whispered a prayer to the river spirits, though no one could say whether it was to bless their passage or forgive it. Back at the bend, Kael lunged and parried, every muscle singing with strain. The Neanderthal leader swung a heavy club, its stone head whistling inches from Kael's skull. The man's strength was staggering, each blow like an avalanche. Kael ducked low, driving his blade toward the man's side, but the leader twisted away, countering with a savage elbow that sent Kael stumbling back. "Hold them," Kael barked, though his voice cracked with effort. "Just hold." A scream cut through the night. Downstream, the ice had given way beneath one of the crossing hunters. His arms thrashed against the current as the river swallowed him, his cries muffled by the roar of churning water. The others froze for half a breath, their instincts warring between rescue and survival. Then Argon snarled, shoving them forward. "Move!" "He's gone." Kael didn't see it, but he felt it, the shift in the air, the panic rippling through his people like a broken drumbeat. He gritted his teeth, throwing himself back into the fight with renewed ferocity. The Neanderthal leader seemed to sense the fracture too. His torch arced through the darkness like a comet before slamming into the snow, embers hissing against the frost. With both hands free, he roared and charged Kael head-on. They collided with a sound that was more animal than human, grappling in the slush, teeth bared like predators locked in the same cage. Cracks shrieked under their weight. Downstream, the second group was almost across. The ice flexed and dipped beneath them, but they could see the far bank now, a promise of safety etched in shadow and frostbitten trees. One hunter whispered, "Almost," though the word felt like a lie. Then Kael made his move. He drove his knee upward, hard, catching the leader off balance. As the man staggered, Kael wrenched free and slammed his shoulder into him, forcing him back toward the bend's thicker ice. For a heartbeat, Kael almost believed they could escape cleanly, draw the Neanderthals in, then vanish into the mist. But fate had other plans. A hollow boom echoed across the river as the fractured sheet downstream began to collapse in great, jagged slabs. Water erupted through the cracks, black and merciless, swallowing everything it touched. Two more hunters vanished with it, their screams cut off as if the river had bitten them whole. Both groups froze, the Homo sapiens on the far bank, gasping and horrified, the Neanderthals mid-charge, their faces lit by the torch's dying glow. For an instant, they were no longer enemies but witnesses to the same indifferent power. Kael seized that moment. "Run!" he roared, voice raw and commanding. His group broke, sprinting toward the safer stretch of ice where the others had crossed. The Neanderthal leader didn't follow. He stood rooted at the river's edge, chest heaving, eyes burning with something Kael couldn't name. Hatred, yes, but also recognition. A wordless understanding passed between them, as heavy as the storm above and as cold as the water beneath. Then the ice moaned again, louder, like the river itself laughing. Kael didn't look back. The snow had hardened into sharp ridges overnight, turning the valley into a labyrinth of pale knives. Kael's breath hung in the air like a ghost as he motioned his hunters forward, their bodies hunched and silent against the jagged silhouettes of ice. They thought they were stalking shadows, but they were the ones being stalked. The first sign was sound, or the lack of it. Even the wind had stilled, and in that unnatural quiet, Kael's skin prickled. Too late, he caught the flicker of movement above them, shapes cut from the same stone and frost as the cliffs, Neanderthals. They descended with terrifying precision. No cries, no hesitation, just the thud of heavy bodies hitting snow and the crack of wood against bone. One of Kael's men dropped instantly, his skull crushed beneath a club wrapped in sinew and stone. The force of it was unlike anything Kael had seen before. These were not hunters driving prey. They were predators reclaiming ground. Kael spun, spear raised, but another blow shattered the shaft in his hands. A Neanderthal roared, a sound so raw it seemed to come from the earth itself, and drove Kael back into the drift. Around him, chaos ignited, sapiens scattering, some fighting, some slipping on ice slicked with blood. The Neanderthals moved as one organism, their bulk turning the narrow pass into a killing ground. Then came the moment that would burn into Kael's memory. The largest of them, a brute with scarred arms and a mane of frost-bitten hair, lifted one of Kael's hunters as though he were weightless and hurled him against the ice wall. The impact cracked both man and stone. The scream died before it left his throat. And just like that, the valley belonged to the Neanderthals. Kael's chest heaved as he scrambled backward, snow biting at his palms, his mind caught between rage and awe. This wasn't just an ambush. It was a message, carved in blood and bone. You do not own this land. The wind had died, but its absence left behind a silence deeper than death. Kael walked slowly across the frozen battlefield, the snow muffling each step. Around him lay the remnants of both species, broken spears, shattered skulls, open eyes that no longer saw. He knelt beside a fallen Neanderthal, his once enemy, now just another face swallowed by the cold. Gently, Kael closed the man's eyes, not with hatred, but with the quiet reverence of one who understands. No one truly wins a war of extinction. Behind him, the last of the sapiens gathered on the ridge, their silhouettes gaunt and shivering beneath the dying light. Isla stood by his side, her voice barely a whisper. "They're gone," she said. "We are the last." Kael didn't answer at first. He stared toward the endless horizon, where the sun bled into snow. "We didn't win," he finally murmured. "We just remained." That night, in the mouth of a cave, Kael painted. With ash, blood, and trembling hands, he etched the memory into stone, not a victory, but a reckoning. Two peoples, once alive, now reduced to symbols beneath his fingers. Isla added her palm print beside his. "This is how they'll live on," she said, not as enemies, but as part of the same long story. Days turned to years. The survivors built new fires, raised children, and spoke softer when the wind carried echoes. One child wandered into the cave and placed his hand upon the old paintings. He did not understand them, not yet, but something in his blood stirred. The memory lived on, not his words. Kael grew old, his hair silver like frost. One evening, he stood alone on a high ridge, staring down at the valley that had once been a graveyard. The sky burned gold. The snow no longer fell. He closed his eyes. We were not the strongest, he thought, not the wisest, but we were the ones who endured, and so we must remember. Then he turned, walking slowly back toward the glow of firelight, where a new world waited, one built not on conquest, but on memory. Because in the end, survival is not glory. It is burden, it is story, and someone must carry it forward.